What happens when the most powerful man in the city can't escape the truth of a child with nothing? In this final chapter, Sterling Voss, the billionaire who thought he owned Chicago, faces a choice that will decide not just his empire, but his soul. And it all begins with one question that refuses to leave him alone. Sterling didn't sleep that night. He stood at his windows until dawn painted the city gold, drinking scotch and reading article after article about the families his projects had displaced. By morning, he'd consumed more information about housing inequality than in all his previous years combined. The facts were stark: average rent in his developments, $3,200 per month. Average income in displaced families, $31,000 per year. Percentage of displaced families who found comparable housing nearby, 12%. Percentage who left the city entirely, 47%. Numbers that had once represented profit margins now had faces attached. Mrs. Alvarez. Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Chen and her 4 children. At 7 a.m., Sterling called his assistant. "Janet, I need you to find someone for me." "Of course, Mr. Voss." "Who?" "A boy named Micah. 12 years old. He was at the press conference yesterday." Silence. Then, "Sir? Is everything all right?" "Just find him. I want to meet with him." "I'm not sure that's advisable." "Patricia thinks." "I don't care what Patricia thinks. Find the boy." It took 4 hours. Micah wasn't in the system, no school records, no emergency contacts, no permanent address. But Sterling's people were thorough. They found him at the Harper Heights Community Center, helping elderly residents understand their eviction notices. Sterling had never been inside the community center. As his Mercedes pulled up outside, he saw the building through different eyes. The brick walls weren't obstacles to his development, they were home to programs that fed hungry children, provided job training for unemployed adults, offered English classes for immigrants like Mrs. Alvarez. Inside, the building hummed with life. In one room, toddlers played while their mothers attended a parenting class. In another, teenagers worked on homework while volunteers provided tutoring. In the main hall, elderly residents gathered for lunch and conversation. This wasn't just a building Sterling planned to demolish. It was the heart of a community. Sterling found Micah in a corner, reading to a group of children. The boy's voice was gentle as he navigated through a picture book, stopping to answer questions, encouraging shy kids to participate. When story time ended, Micah looked up and saw Sterling. No surprise. No fear. Just quiet acknowledgement. "Mr. Voss, and Micah." The children scattered to other activities, leaving them alone. "You wanted to see me," Micah said. It wasn't a question. Sterling nodded. "Can we talk privately?" Micah led him to a small office, the center director's space, cluttered with files and photographs of community events. They sat across from each other, the boy in his threadbare hoodie, the man in his $5,000 suit. "You made quite an impression yesterday," Sterling said. Micah shrugged. "I just told the truth. The truth has consequences. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. The city council is reviewing the project. My board wants damage control." "And what do you want?" The question caught Sterling off guard. What did he want? For 25 years, the answer had been simple: more. More money, more power, more control, more success. But sitting in this cluttered office, looking at a boy who owned nothing but somehow seemed richer than him, Sterling wasn't sure anymore. "I want to understand," he said finally. "Understand what?" "How you knew. About Mrs. Alvarez. About Mr. Johnson's rent. About Mrs. Chen's salary. That information isn't public." Micah's smile was sad. "When you're invisible, people talk around you like you're not there. I listen. I learn. I remember." And you decided to use that information to embarrass me? I decided to use that information to help them. Micah leaned forward. Mr. Voss, do you know what it's like to lose everything? Sterling's throat tightened. No. I do. When my mom died, I lost the only home I'd ever known. I learned what it feels like when the world treats you like you don't matter. When adults make decisions about your life without asking what you want or need. The boy's voice stayed steady, but Sterling could see pain flickering in his eyes. These people, Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Johnson, all the families you're displacing, they're about to learn what I learned. And you're the one teaching them. Sterling looked down at his hands. I never thought about it that way. Because you didn't have to. When you have enough money, other people's problems become invisible. And what would you have me do? Cancel the project? Lose $200 million? Micah shook his head. I don't want you to lose money. I want you to make money differently. What do you mean? Build the project. But build it for everyone. Make some units affordable. Give Mr. Johnson space for his barbershop. Help Mrs. Alvarez stay in her neighborhood. Show the city that development doesn't have to mean displacement. Sterling felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity. That would cost millions more than planned. How much more? Sterling did quick calculations in his head. 15, maybe 20 million. And how much profit were you planning to make? 65 million. So you'd still make 45 million. Still more money than most people see in a lifetime. But this time, instead of making money by hurting people, you'd make money by helping them. The logic was simple. The math was manageable. The precedent would be revolutionary. Sterling studied the boy across from him. Why do you care what I do? This doesn't affect you directly. Micah's answer came without hesitation. Because caring about each other is what makes us human. And I still believe you're human, Mr. Voss. Even if you've forgotten. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had seen his humanity? When was the last time he'd seen it himself? People will say I'm going soft, Sterling said quietly. People will say you're doing the right thing. My board will fight me. Your board works for you, not the other way around. It's not that simple. Micah leaned back in his chair. Mr. Voss, yesterday you stood in front of cameras and had no words when a 12-year-old asked you basic questions about your own project. Today, you're sitting in a community center you plan to demolish, talking to that same 12-year-old about changing everything. Sterling couldn't argue with that. If you can do all that, Micah continued, you can convince a room full of rich men that helping people is good business. Sterling laughed despite himself. You make it sound easy. I didn't say it was easy. I said it was right. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Sterling spoke, if I do this, if I change the project, what happens to you? What do you mean? Where will you live? What about school? What about your future? Micah shrugged. I'll figure it out. I always do. Sterling felt something crack open in his chest. This boy had just handed him a roadmap to redemption, and he was asking for nothing in return. That's not good enough, Sterling said. If I'm going to change how I do business, I might as well start with you. What happens when the most powerful man in the city can't escape the truth of a child with nothing? In this final chapter, Sterling Voss, the billionaire who thought he owned Chicago, faces a choice that will decide not just his empire, but his soul. And it all begins with one question that refuses to leave him alone, the board meeting. The Voss Tower boardroom had witnessed many hostile takeovers. But never one like this. Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, facing 12 men and women who'd made fortunes following his lead. They'd been summoned on 2 hours' notice. They arrived expecting damage control. They got revolution instead. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling began, we're changing the Harper Heights project. The silence was profound. Richard Blackwell, the chairman, spoke first. Sterling, I know yesterday was difficult, but we can't let one viral moment derail a $200 million investment. This isn't about the video. Patricia Chen opened her laptop. I've prepared 3 strategies for moving forward. We can paint this as a learning experience, announce some cosmetic community programs, and proceed as planned. We're not proceeding as planned. Eleanor Martinez, head of development, leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? Sterling stood and walked to the wall-mounted monitor. With a remote, he displayed a new set of architectural plans. We're incorporating affordable housing into the development. 30% of units will rent for no more than $1,200 per month. We're including commercial space for existing small businesses at subsidized rates. We're building a new community center to replace the one we're demolishing. The room erupted. That's economic suicide. The profit margins, our investors will revolt. Sterling raised his hand. The room fell silent. The revised project will cost an additional $18 million. Our profit drops from $65 million to $47 million. That's an $18 million loss. Blackwell's face was red. That's an $18 million investment in doing business differently. Eleanor's voice was icy. Sterling, what's gotten into you? Since when do you care about affordable housing? Since I realized that our success shouldn't require other people's failure. Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is about that kid, isn't it? You're letting a homeless child dictate corporate strategy? Sterling turned to face her directly. I'm letting my conscience dictate corporate strategy. I recommend you try it sometime. The barb hit home. Patricia's cheeks flushed. This is insane, Blackwell said. You're talking about fundamentally changing how we do business based on one bad press conference. I'm talking about fundamentally changing how we do business because it's the right thing to do. Right according to who? According to the families we've displaced over the years. According to the communities we've scattered. According to basic human decency. Eleanor's voice turned calculating. Sterling, you're not thinking clearly. Take a few days to consider. I've been thinking clearly for the first time in 25 years. Sterling clicked to the next slide, financial projections. Even with the revised plans, this project delivers a 32% return on investment. That's better than most of our competitors' best projects. We'll still make $47 million in profit. We'll just make it without destroying a community. The numbers were compelling, but the resistance was deeper than mathematics. These people had built their careers on maximizing profit regardless of social cost. Sterling was asking them to fundamentally change their worldview. What about future projects? Asked James Potter, head of acquisitions. If we set this precedent, every development becomes a social program. Maybe that's not a bad thing. The room fell silent again. Sterling looked around the table at faces he'd known for years. Some showed confusion. Others showed concern. A few showed something that might have been fear. They were afraid he was going soft. They were afraid he was losing his edge. They were afraid that caring about people would make them weak. Sterling understood their fear because he'd shared it for decades. Let me tell you what I learned yesterday, he said quietly. I learned that we've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. We've been proud of displacing families because it meant higher profits. We've been celebrating the closure of small businesses because it meant less competition for our retail tenants. He paused, letting his words settle. We've been so focused on winning that we forgot to ask what we were winning against. Turns out, we were winning against our own neighbors. Against families trying to stay in their homes. Against small business owners trying to live their dreams. Eleanor's voice was sharp. Business isn't a charity, Sterling. You're right. But it doesn't have to be warfare either. Sterling clicked to his final slide, a photograph from yesterday's press conference. Micah, small and serious, looking up at Sterling from the crowd. This boy owns nothing. Sleeps in an abandoned laundromat. Hasn't had a home in 2 years. But yesterday, he taught me more about business than all our market research combined. What could a homeless kid possibly teach you about business? Patricia's voice dripped disdain. That our business affects real people. That our success should lift others up, not tear them down. That the strongest foundations aren't built on other people's failures. Sterling turned away from the screen to face his board directly. Here's what's going to happen. We're implementing the revised Harper Heights plan. We're establishing a community development fund for future projects. And we're changing how Voss Development does business. Blackwell's voice was cold. And if the board votes against this? Sterling smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in that boardroom in years. Then I'll resign and start my own company. With my name, my reputation, and my contacts, I'll be your biggest competitor within 6 months. And I'll be building affordable housing while you're still displacing families. The threat was real. They all knew Sterling could make good on it. But more than that, they could see something in his eyes they'd never seen before, conviction. All in favor of the revised Harper Heights plan? One by one, hands rose around the table. Not because they believed in the mission. But because they believed in Sterling's ability to make anything profitable. Motion carries, Sterling said. Patricia, I want you to schedule a press conference for tomorrow. We're announcing the changes publicly. As the board members filed out, muttering among themselves, Sterling remained at the window overlooking the city. 47 floors below, people were living their lives, unaware that one of the city's most powerful men had just chosen their welfare over his own maximum profit. It felt like the first honest decision he'd made in decades. The second press conference. 24 hours later, Sterling stood at the same podium where his world had changed. But this time, everything was different. The same community center loomed behind him, but now it wore signs of hope instead of despair. Community meeting tonight, all welcome, and Harper Heights, building together. The same crowd had gathered, but the energy had shifted. Reporters still held microphones and cameras, but now they seemed genuinely curious rather than hunting for drama. City officials still wore their political smiles, but there was real interest in their eyes. The protesters were still there, but their signs had changed. Thank you for listening, and this is how change happens. And in the front row, sitting cross-legged on the ground with his notebook in his lap, was Micah. Sterling looked out at the crowd and felt something he'd never experienced at a press conference: peace. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying none of yesterday's political polish. 24 hours ago, I stood at this podium and couldn't answer a simple question from a 12-year-old boy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The question was, if you take away people's homes and businesses and community, what are you really building? Sterling paused, his eyes finding Micah's face. I couldn't answer because I'd never bothered to ask it. For 25 years, I've measured success by profit margins and return on investment. I've called displacing families progress and destroying communities development. The crowd was completely silent now. Yesterday, that boy forced me to look in a mirror. And I didn't like what I saw. Sterling stepped away from the podium, closer to the crowd. So today, I'm announcing fundamental changes to the Harper Heights project. We're not just building luxury condos and high-end retail. We're building a mixed-income community that includes affordable housing, subsidized commercial space for local businesses, and a new community center that will serve this neighborhood for generations. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Mrs. Alvarez, Sterling said, looking directly at the elderly woman in the crowd, you will not be displaced. We're renovating your building, not demolishing it. You'll have a new apartment in the same neighborhood where you've lived for 30 years. Mrs. Alvarez pressed her hand to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Johnson, Sterling continued, finding the barber in the crowd, we're reserving commercial space for your barbershop in our new development. Same rent you're paying now, guaranteed for 10 years. Mr. Johnson's mouth fell open. And Mrs. Chen, Sterling said, though he couldn't see her in the crowd, we're creating a childcare center in the new community center, along with job training programs and English classes. The crowd's energy was shifting from surprise to something approaching celebration. This project will cost more and profit less than originally planned, Sterling continued. But it will do something more important than generate maximum returns. It will prove that development can strengthen communities instead of destroying them. A reporter called out, Mr. Voss, what changed your mind? Sterling smiled, looking at Micah. A boy with nothing taught me what it means to have everything. Another reporter, aren't you concerned about investor reaction? I'm more concerned about community reaction. Our investors will still make substantial returns. Our neighbors will get to keep their homes. That seems like a fair trade. What about future projects? Every Voss development project going forward will include affordable housing and community benefits. We're changing how we do business. The questions continued for 30 minutes. Sterling answered each one with the same calm confidence he'd once reserved for boardroom presentations. But now his confidence came from doing right, not from maximizing profit. As the press conference wound down, Sterling made one final announcement. I'd like to introduce someone who's joining the Voss development team as our new community relations director. He gestured toward Micah, who looked up from his notebook with surprise. Micah Chen will be paid a salary, receive health insurance, and get housing assistance while he finishes his education. He'll also consult on all our future projects to ensure they serve the communities where we build. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Micah stood slowly, still looking stunned. Sterling walked over and extended his hand. What do you say? Ready to change how business gets done in this city? Micah shook his hand solemnly. Only if you promise to keep listening. I promise. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Sterling with something he'd never experienced, gratitude. Mrs. Alvarez hugged him through tears. Mr. Johnson shook his hand so vigorously Sterling thought his arm might detach. Community leaders thanked him for setting a new standard. But the moment that mattered most came when a small voice said, Mr. Voss? Sterling turned to find a little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugging on his pants leg. Thank you for not taking away my home. Sterling knelt down to her level. What's your name? Sophia. I live upstairs from Mrs. Alvarez. Sterling looked into Sophia's dark eyes and saw something he'd been blind to for decades, the face of everyone his projects had affected. The children displaced. The families scattered. The communities broken. Sophia, he said quietly, I promise I'll never take away anyone's home again. She smiled and ran back to her mother. Sterling stood slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled from kneeling on concrete, his heart full of something he'd forgotten how to feel, purpose. 6 months later. The Harper Heights community development was taking shape. Where once stood aging apartment buildings scheduled for demolition, construction cranes now lifted steel beams into place. But these weren't just luxury towers reaching toward profit margins. They were homes rising toward hope. The development would house 400 families, 120 in affordable units, 280 in market-rate apartments. Ground floor retail space would accommodate Mr. Johnson's expanded barbershop, Mrs. Garcia's restaurant, and a dozen other local businesses. The new community center would be 3 times larger than the old one, with classrooms, a gymnasium, and a technology lab. Sterling visited the construction site every Tuesday morning, not for progress reports or cost analyses, but for conversations with future residents. He learned their names, their stories, their dreams for the neighborhood. Mrs. Alvarez brought him homemade tamales and told him about her grandchildren who would now have a safe place to play. Mr. Johnson sketched plans for a barber training program he wanted to start in the community center. Mrs. Chen, whose English had improved dramatically, was enrolled in business classes to help her start her own cleaning service. But the biggest change was in Micah. The boy who'd once slept in an abandoned laundromat now lived in a studio apartment 3 blocks from the development site. He attended one of the city's best private schools on scholarship, but spent every afternoon at the community center, tutoring kids and helping seniors navigate social services. His official title was Community Relations Director, but his real job was being Sterling's conscience. "Mr. Voss," Micah said one Tuesday morning as they walked through the construction site, "there's something we need to discuss." Sterling smiled. In 6 months, he'd learned that when Micah said they needed to discuss something, it usually meant Sterling was about to be challenged to do better. "What's on your mind?" "The Riverside Project. Sterling's next development, a 20-block mixed-use project on the city's west side." "What about it? Have you talked to the families who live there?" Sterling paused. The honest answer was no, not directly. His team had conducted community outreach, which mostly meant informational meetings where they explained what was happening rather than asking what residents wanted. "Not yet," Sterling admitted. Maybe we should change that." "What do you suggest?" Micah pulled out his notebook, the same battered book he'd been carrying when they first met, now held together with even more duct tape. "What if we started every project by listening? What if, before we designed a single building, we spent a month in the neighborhood just talking to people? Learning what they need. What they want. What they're afraid of." Sterling nodded slowly. "Community-first development." "Exactly. Instead of trying to convince people to accept our plans, we build our plans around their lives." It was revolutionary. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It was exactly right. "Draft a proposal," Sterling said. "We'll implement it on Riverside." As they continued walking through the construction site, Sterling reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. Voss Development had completed 3 projects using their new community-centered approach. Each had been more expensive and less profitable than traditional developments. Each had also been more successful in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars: stronger communities, preserved local businesses, families able to stay in their neighborhoods. The company's reputation had transformed. Instead of being feared as neighborhood destroyers, they were now sought out as community builders. City councils competed to attract Voss developments. Residents held welcome rallies instead of protests. Sterling's personal life had changed too. His penthouse felt less like a monument to isolation and more like a home. He'd started having people over, Micah for homework help, Mrs. Alvarez for cooking lessons, Mr. Johnson for chess games. The silence that had once defined his evenings was now filled with laughter, conversation, and something he'd forgotten how to value: genuine human connection. His board had initially resisted the new approach, but the results spoke louder than their objections. Voss Development's projects now attracted premium investors specifically because of their community benefits. The company's brand value had increased by 40%. Sterling personally had been featured on magazine covers as the developer who changed development. But the recognition that mattered most came from unexpected sources. Last month, Sophia, the little girl who'd thanked him for not taking away her home, had drawn him a picture. It showed stick figures of him and Micah standing in front of colorful buildings, with the words, "Thank you for caring," written in crayon. Sterling had framed it and hung it in his office, next to his MBA from Wharton and his Real Estate Developer of the Year award. The drawing meant more than both diplomas combined. The lesson. That evening, Sterling and Micah sat on the roof of the community center, watching the sun set over Chicago. The city stretched out before them, millions of people living their lives, chasing their dreams, building their families. Can I ask you something? Sterling said. Always. That first day, when you stood up to me at the press conference. Were you scared? Micah considered the question. Terrified. Then why did you do it? Because being scared of speaking up isn't as scary as staying silent while people get hurt. Sterling nodded. I spent 25 years being scared of the wrong thing. What do you mean? I was scared of being weak. Scared of caring too much. Scared that if I showed compassion, people would take advantage of me. And now? Now I'm scared of going back to the person I used to be. Scared of forgetting what you taught me. Micah smiled. You won't forget. You know why? Why? Because once you see people as people instead of obstacles, you can't unsee it. Once you know your actions affect real families, real dreams, real lives, you can't unknow it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city breathe around them. Micah? Yeah. Thank you. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Thank you for proving that people can change. That power can be used to lift others up instead of tear them down. As darkness settled over Chicago, two unlikely friends sat together on a rooftop, surrounded by a community they'd helped save. One had wealth beyond measure. The other had wisdom beyond his years. And both had learned the same lesson: real power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can give. The truth is, we all have more power than we think. The power to listen when others speak. The power to help when others struggle. The power to care when others are forgotten. Sterling Voss thought his power came from money and influence. But his real power came from his ability to change, to grow, to choose compassion over profit. Micah thought he was powerless because he owned nothing. But his real power came from his courage to speak truth, to stand up for others, to believe that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. Have you ever underestimated your own power to make a difference? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? Share your story in the comments, because every voice matters, and every story has the power to inspire change. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that no one is too small to create change and no one is too powerful to need changing, then you belong in our community. Hit that like button if you believe the smallest voices often carry the heaviest truths. Comment, "Truth wins," if you've ever seen someone's conscience awakened by an unexpected source. Subscribe to Mr. Newell Stories. Because tomorrow's story might be about someone just like you, someone who found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. And remember, in a world that often feels cold and divided, the warmest thing you can do is show someone that their life matters. That their voice matters. That they matter. Because sometimes, the person who needs to hear that most is looking right back at you in the mirror. Until next time, keep listening for the truth in unexpected places. Keep speaking up for those who need your voice. And keep believing that the smallest acts of courage can create the biggest waves of change. This is Mr. Newell Stories, where every ending is really just a beginning.